Hey guys, welcome to another Kickster review. So as promised, today I'll be giving my full spoiler review of The Flash, starring Ezra Miller and Michael Keaton. And so I'm going to talk first about the story and everything that I liked and disliked about it throughout the whole film, and then I'm going to go into the characters and talk about what I liked and disliked from all of the characters. And I'm going to be covering all spoilers, so no holding back. So if you don't want any spoilers, don't watch this video right now, but come back once you've seen this film. So the basic story is really reminiscent of Back to the Future. Basically, Barry, he only has his father left who's in prison. Meanwhile, his mum has died. She was killed years before. So basically, he figures out, how I can reverse time. With my speed, I can actually reverse time and bring my mother back and bring my father back out of prison. So he basically reverses time and he gets what he wants out of that. But then, of course, everything else goes to hell around him. So then he's forced into the situation where he encounters his own younger self, and they've basically got to team up and fix all the damage, and that takes them to many different places to try and just repair everything that's going on. And throughout that story, he's realizing he's in a universe where there is no Justice League, but there is a Batman. It's a different Batman. It's Michael Keaton's Batman. And instead of Superman, there is a Supergirl, essentially, but she's been locked up and held in a prison her whole life and doesn't have any strength. But he finds that out later on when he teams up with Michael Keaton to go and rescue her, and then she's unleashed, and then so forth. It all ends in a big battle that takes place in the desert. Now, the main villain of this film is Zod. So General Zod from obviously Man of Steel. So this is set in an alternate universe, by the way, so it's not the same universe that he dies in Man of Steel, but it is the same character essentially, and with the same ramifications where he's trying to terraform the earth with the world engine. And so when you really break down this film to the crux of it and see what is it really about, it's really about the idea that you can't change the past. And basically Barry Allen goes through the whole film, the story plays out, so basically where he realizes that no matter what he does, no matter how many times he tries to change things or fix things, it only, one, makes things worse, and two, doesn't bring it back to what it can be or to what it was. So that's the whole lesson here of the whole film. So what I liked about this film is also the same as what I disliked about it, which is that I liked that it was reminiscent of Back to the Future, but what I disliked is that it doesn't really do it as well as Back to the Future. So it's just like a subpar film when you compare it to something like that. But it's also an emotional story, it's very much about, parents and family and, trying to bring your parents basically back from the dead, something that we would all probably wish in our life for anyone who's lost parents. It's, it's very fundamental and core to our being that we would wish to reverse certain events in our life. And so with that said, the outcome of this whole story is that Barry realizes he can't save his mom. This is a fixed point in time in every universe that gets explained earlier in the film by Michael Keaton's Batman about how universes are kind of like a spaghetti, but they have like crossover points that are fixed points for all of them. And he comes to realize that his mom dying is a fixed point. That's something he can't change. And so he has to learn to let go of that. And which he does, which is a really emotional scene towards the end of the film when he comes to terms with that. Like it's doing something so simple as moving a can of tomatoes in a supermarket, and it changes the course of history because his mom ends up dying instead of living. So it's like little things like that really add up, and it builds to an emotional ending there, which I really liked. I guess the problems I have with the story here are mainly to do with the villain side of the film, like the antagonist. So Zod, as I mentioned, is the main villain. There is another villain in it, which is basically, from what I understand, his name is like Dark Flash. He's kind of like the third Flash that exists, but he really only appears at the end of the film. And he's kind of been behind it all. He's been kind of egging on younger Barry to turn him more corrupt, which is what kind of happens to him throughout the film, where he kind of gets a sense of power and what he can do with his powers. And what I didn't like is two main things about the villains is that, one, it's Zod being the villain is very much reliant on the history with Man of Steel. So the filmmakers are basically saying, okay, we're not going to do anything to kind of build him up as a villain. Instead, we're going to take it for granted that the audience has seen Man of Steel and they know who he is and what he's capable of, and we'll just go from there, which I think is a complete cop-out when it comes to making your own film. Whilst he's the same exact villain, they've got to introduce him again, or not necessarily even introduce him again, but at least show that he's an imposing threat. He's not shown throughout this whole film. He doesn't really appear till the end in the final battle, and it's just, and even then, the performance of Michael Shannon in that role just seems like phoned in, almost like he didn't even really want to be there. So it just feels very forced and not really earned in terms of the stakes of this film. But the thing that actually bugged me more about the villain was that it's more the circumstances that are the villain of this film, that are the issue, the problem. It's not so much the actual villain himself, Zod. And you know, that is kind of reminiscent of Back to the Future as well. Like there's no real villain in Back to the Future. It's just he's dealing with his circumstances to try and get back to his present. And that's the same thing that Barry is dealing with. But I don't like that when there is a clear villain. You know, that's fine if that was the contained story that they were going to do. But because you had this actual villain in Zod, it felt like we dealt too much with the circumstances and not enough with the actual villain. And neither of them got properly paid off by doing that. They should have committed to one or the other, and that way they would have felt more fleshed out. Yeah, I think the story is pretty much just average at best, and it really does thrive on its emotion, its emotional core. I think that's what keeps it going along and keeps you invested enough to want to see it through. Now, as for the characters, obviously starting with Barry Allen, both Barrys, I think Ezra Miller did a pretty good job. I am not a fan of Ezra Miller personally, like to do with his personal stuff, but that aside, I think he did a good job. Obviously, I think many know he's not a comic accurate Flash. The Flash from the comics is quite different, both in looks and personality to him. But that said, with the Flash that they've created in this universe, he, honored that and he stuck with that. And I think he did a pretty good job. And considering he was playing two roles, I think he did very well. And on top of that, particularly having the younger Barry Allen, who's more annoying and kind of obnoxious and things like that, I think whether it was intentional or unintentional, it made the actual Barry look more like kind of authoritative and more in charge, more of a leader and a bit more normal. Even though he's still got his quirks and all that, it just made him feel a bit better, and you actually liked him more because the other one was so annoying. So I'm not sure if that was intentional on the filmmaker's part, but either way it worked. And so yeah, I bought into both Barrys in this film, quite enjoyed them. Then there was obviously Michael Keaton's Batman, who I was personally most excited to see from this film, and didn't disappoint in my eyes. He did a great job. I'm just basically stepping right back into those old shoes, and he brought it as both Bruce Wayne and as Batman. Now obviously Batman, is a lot of it is CGI with the action, but it was awesome to see him properly kicking ass, particularly compared to his own personal movies where you don't see a lot of action. So it was cool to see him with this modern filmmaking scenario, and yeah, just kicking a lot of butt. And kind of big spoiler, he gets killed at the end multiple times. Well, first when he gets killed, he crashes his Batwing into the Zod ship, sacrificing himself, and then Flash reverses time, comes back again, and then he takes on one of Zod's minions and gets killed in that process. And then it's kind of understood that this is another fixed point in time. This particular Batman always must die. And so that's another thing that that's where he comes to realize that also his mum dying is another fixed point in time that he can't change, as well as this particular universe dying at the hands of Zod. So that's a very, emotional moment. It's very deep, and I like that. And wasn't happy to see him die, but I think it kind of worked in that you feel like, okay, it honored his character enough, but it also kind of tied up his story a little bit. And so, yeah, I like that. The biggest surprise for me with this film was actually Sasha Calle's Supergirl. So going into it, I was thinking she's going to be a Mary Sue, who's just a girl boss, capable of everything, is better than everyone, talks down to the male characters and all that, which is what we've become so accustomed to seeing. None of that. She was great. She wasn't in the film a lot. She was mainly in the third act from when they rescued her till her end, and she was great. I mean, she had that kind of stoic personality, but also a bit of that, showed that anger, a bit of that humor. She showed a bit of everything and a bit of heart. Like I liked her a lot. And so it was actually kind of shocking when you see her die, not once but twice, similar to Keaton's Batman, where she's another fixed point in time where she just always dies in this universe. And yeah, it's kind of sad when you see that happen, but look, I think she was cool. She embodied Supergirl well in terms of her powers, and yeah, no problems with her. In fact, I quite enjoyed her. So the other characters that are, I think, underserved here is the parents, Barry's parents. You do see them a significant amount in the beginning of the film when he like with flashbacks with his mom, and then obviously in real time with his dad. But then once he goes back in time and has a kind of brief encounter with them, you don't really see them at all again until the very end of the film. And I thought that was just a complete missed opportunity, because, you know, if they were following kind of what Back to the Future did, you know, they should have shown them a bit more throughout, really built up Barry's love for his mum, which, you know, we got the love there. We saw it. He really loves his mum. We could see that, and that was emotional. But I think it would have made it even more so to have had her involved throughout the film, and even the dad, just to, and maybe have tied their story into it in some way, because, you know, we saw the ramifications of what Barry did, but it didn't feel as great as it should have, because they were not there throughout the whole film. And I think this film was just trying to do too much, that they just didn't have the time to incorporate them. And so, yeah, I think that was disappointing as well from a character perspective. So I've already mentioned Zod and what I think of him. I think he was completely underserved in this film. They didn't build him up enough, and so he wasn't a threatening enough villain when it came for his actual part in the film. And that, you know, I think greatly affected the story. But I think even more, the thing that was actually probably the most disappointing in this film is the cameos. So full spoiler here, there are a lot of cameos at the end that are completely unnecessary. I mean, you see Christopher Reeve Superman, you see Nicolas Cage Superman, you see Adam West Batman, you see a bunch of other old actors who have played those roles that are kind of like little Easter eggs for die-hard fans that are above my knowledge. But you see a lot of these famous faces, but they're just completely irrelevant. They mean nothing to the story. Why? They're just showing them for the sake of showing them, and that annoys me. I'm just over this trope of just throwing in cameos here and there into films just to please audiences and, you know, get that nostalgia bait. Really, it's completely useless. So that was disappointing. Not that I was expecting much from these cameos. I heard whispers of them going into the film, but they did it worse than I thought they were gonna do, and so that was disappointing to see. Doesn't take away from the film, really. It doesn't affect the story one way or another, but it's just, I thought that was really cheap and that was really unnecessary. Cameos though that I did enjoy were at the very beginning of the film, which was mainly Ben Affleck's Batman. So which you see in the trailers as well. There's just an action scene that takes place where basically Flash is saving these babies falling from a burning building, or falling down building, and part of that Ben Affleck's Batman is chasing the criminals along these highways, like on his bat pod and all that, and it just makes for awesome action. So, but I think it's more than a cameo, because he's there for that whole action sequence, and then he even pops up again a little bit later. The other cameo was Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman, who, yeah, that's a cameo. She just appears and says basically one line, and that's it. So kind of irrelevant there. But yeah, look, Ben Affleck's Batman was awesome. And during that opening battle scene, you get this whole thing with Barry where it shows his suit draining in battery and power throughout, and how he has to keep basically eating sweets and all these things to get his power back up. And they showed it so much in that opening sequence that you thought, okay, this is going to matter at some point later in the film. It literally never came back up. It was completely irrelevant. So in the end, it just kind of made for laughs more than anything else. And like, that's fine if that's all they were going for, but it really felt like they were showing how important it was for him to have his energy. That, like, why would they show that much but then not show it again later on? It also makes for an inconsistency in the plot later on when he's doing things that are more insane than what he was doing at the very beginning of the film. So that's just a thought right there. That's kind of a plot hole, not a huge one, but yeah, it's just it's a shame that they didn't use that in one way later on. So overall, look, I think this film was better than I expected it was going to be. I thought it was going to be just an absolute mess. You know, this film went through absolute development hell, had issues with its main actor. They did reshoot after reshoot after reshoot. I had no idea what we were going to get with this film. I thought it was just going to be a completely incoherent mess. But I was pleasantly surprised to see that it had a pretty fine story, had a lot of emotional beats throughout, had some great performances from all the actors. I think everyone pretty much brought it. Yeah, and it was just, I think, just a good time in the cinema, a good popcorn flick with some great action. CGI, everyone's heard about CGI, it was atrocious, but it didn't take away from the film for me. One, because I knew going in that the CGI was going to be bad, and two, because when the story is there, the CGI, you can kind of forgive it a bit, whereas it doesn't work the other way. When CGI is great but the story sucks, you're not as forgiving of it. So I am willing to forgive when the story is getting by and keeping me invested. I'm willing to put the CGI aside. And yeah, I said in my out of the theater review and in my non-spoiler review that I gave this a 7 out of 10, and I'm sticking with it. It hasn't changed, hasn't gone up or down in my mind. I think it's a solid 7 for a blockbuster film. I'm happy with it. I would definitely watch it again. I would recommend you guys to watch it if you haven't. I think it's just a fun time, something you can either switch your mind off from, or if you are invested in the DC universe and what's left of it, I think you'll enjoy it too. So yeah, that's my thoughts. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll talk to you guys next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See ya.